It's a challenge by choice, so you really choose what you want to share. But I feel like for all of the authors, they took it there, and I think took it there in such creative ways that I feel like evoke this kind of critical cultural knowledge that is often relegated to the margins of academia, but also just like intellectual production at large. And so, we saw authors using approaches like Asian critical race theory and plantation politics and feminismo or conocimiento, radical love, radical healing, and a lot of other approaches. I think one of the chapters that really hit me, they were all powerful in their own way, but there was one where someone wrote it in a way where they were writing a letter to their past self.
Welcome to Student Affairs Now, the online learning community for student affairs educators. I'm your host, Heather Shea. Today on the podcast, I'm talking with the editors of a powerful and timely new book that amplifies the voices of those working within identity-based centers on college campuses, spaces that are often at the heart of equity, inclusion, and belonging work. Together, Jonathan and Stephanie have curated a collection that does not shy away from the hard truths of working in DEI spaces during this time of heightened resistance, while also centering healing, resilience, and joy. We'll talk about what it means to truly shake the table, how storytelling sustains those doing this labor of care and resistance, and what leaders can do to move beyond performative allyship to real transformative support. Student Affairs Now is a premier podcast and learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to higher education and student affairs. For the past 5 years, we've been creating space for meaningful conversations that inform, inspire, and affirm the work of educators everywhere. We are so grateful to our listeners, guests, collaborators, sponsors who have helped this community grow and evolve. We hope these conversations contribute to the field and are restorative to the profession. New episodes drop every Wednesday. You can find us at studentaffairsnow.com, on YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode is sponsored by the Evolve Institute for Higher Education Leadership, Courageous Leadership to Reimagine the Future of Higher Education. As I mentioned, I am your host for today's episode, Heather Shea. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am broadcasting from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples, otherwise known as East Lansing, Michigan, home of Michigan State University, where I work. Let's get today's conversation. Joining me, let me bring us everybody onto the screen here, are the editors of the book, Shaking the Table, Survival and Healing Amongst Identity-Centered Practitioners, Dr. Jonathan McElderry and Dr. Stephanie Hernandez Rivera. So I'm going to read just a really quick bio for each of you, and then we'll jump into questions. So Dr. Jonathan McElderry is the Dean of Student Inclusive Excellence and Assistant Professor at Elon University. A first-generation college scholar, he is deeply committed to enhancing the academic and social experiences of historically marginalized students at predominantly white institutions. And Dr. Stephanie Hernandez Rivera is a Puerto Rican woman, scholar, and educator, serving as an assistant professor of education and the inaugural Dr. Joe Watts Williams School of Education Emerging Professional, also at Elon University. Her research focuses on equity, inclusion, and student development in higher education. I am so excited about this opportunity to discuss your forthcoming book. Actually, by the time we release this episode, it will be out. So I am so excited to talk about your new book. Jonathan, why don't you start? Is there anything you'd like to share about the two of you beyond the brief bios that I just read?
Thanks, Heather. Thanks again for having us. We are 100% grateful just for the podcast, for you, for all the things. The only thing I would add is it's an interesting time period. So Stephanie and I met over 10 years ago, both working at the University of Missouri. And 10 years ago to this time when this is being recorded, we were in the thick of the 2015 protest, so for Concerned Student 1950. And so it's interesting that this book is coming out and that we've co-edited and written parts of it 10 years later as we approach the 10th anniversary. I think what was interesting in that experience is actually Stephanie and I's first scholarly article that we collaborated on was called Your Agenda Item, Our Experience. And it detailed our experience during the protests. Because as administrators, both working in the Black Culture Center and the Multicultural Center, we weren't allowed to do any sort of press. We couldn't meet with any all of the news outlets that came. And so for us, by that time, I had left Mizzou, was at a new institution. Stephanie, I think, had started her doctorate at the institution. And so this was our chance to kind of tell our story and to really get it out there, but do it in a way that fed into the scholarship of higher education.
Wow, I just got kind of chills as you were talking about that, not only that process, but also that it's been 10 years. I mean, a lot has changed in our world in the past 10 years.
Mhm.
Um, Stephanie, I'd love to turn to you. Anything else you'd like to share, but also what does it mean to shake the table and how did that idea kind of become the foundation of this book?
Yes, thank you again, also Heather, for having us. And I think Jonathan hit it all, but we're also both at Elon University now, a decade
I
later,
love
which
it.
is just the wildest thing. I think it kind of just demonstrates like how small higher education is. So to be able to kind of be together in this moment and producing this work and creating this work, I think is a really full circle moment. I also got chills while he was, and I lived it
Yeah.
while he was talking, and sharing. I think for me and I think for Jonathan as well, I feel like shaking the table, that title, but also that action really represents challenging, unsettling, unsteadying the status quo or what we know to be business as usual. And I think for identity center practitioners, that's really been the work. I recall early on in my professional career, I was working in an identity center space. It was my first position in higher education. And at times I was really confused about how people, including like leaders in the space, would talk about equity and inclusion and their commitment towards equity and inclusion, but how actions and dynamics didn't really reflect those supposed values. And for me, as like an early career professional, that was really disorienting. And so I would often ask questions and at times be met with confusing stares or silence or clear annoyance about what I was trying to probe at or understand. And I think that's not uncommon, particularly for early career practitioners, but even for those who have been in identity center work for some times. But it reflects this destabilizing of the table. And to me, that's an act of resistance, especially when we often use that metaphor of the table of wanting a seat at the table or not being invited to the table. Or if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that identity center practitioners are, when we're at the table, we're challenging business as usual. But I include myself in that because I feel like that's part of my identity, like as a scholar practitioner. Um, but also that even when we're not at that table physically, we're still in a way destabilizing it and shaking it by having to be discussed, by having to be talked about, by being an agenda item on the table. And so I think that's part of the impetus of, us kind of like going with this title. I just remember, I don't remember exactly how it unfolded, but I just remember it clicking and, us saying like shaking the table. Like, I don't know, Jonathan, if you remember it the same way.
Um, we can probably some one of the many brainstorming opportunities that we have. Stephanie and I are like I said, we work together again now and live close by each other, always with each other. So there's times when like an idea will pop up and I'll text her be like, say this in your notes section or say this like somewhere, and we'll be like, we'll talk about it later and expand on it. I think we just we're in the midst of actually doing co-editing our first book, and this idea just kind of hit. And we were like, okay, we need to finish this book, but like we need this proposal turned in and see what comes of it. And so I think
Oh, yes.
it came out of like us just naturally having conversations, kind of banter back and forth like we normally do, which is
Yeah.
where our great ideas kind of come from. So yeah.
I love that. I promise I'm not going to talk too much about my own experience as an identity center practitioner, because you all know that that's been was my background as well. But I think the table as a metaphor is really fantastic, and I think it's that idea of getting a seat at the table, which is really a seat at the place where decisions are being made and power is being held. So I love hearing that, how you all embrace that and then brought this to like this point of destabilization and resistance.
Mhm.
Um, so, I mean, I think when you all probably started writing this book, we were in a little bit of a different place as a country. And I'm really curious, as this has evolved, as things in general have evolved, as climate and higher ed has evolved. Jonathan, can you talk a little bit about why this book, why now? Why is it important to center the voices and experiences of identity center practitioners?
Yeah, so when we first kind of had the idea, it was right at the beginning of that wave when we started seeing some of the DEI laws. Um,
Mm-hmm.
kind of start to pop up in different states. And so that's when we first started writing it. Now we didn't know that we would be in a place where people were having to close centers and do all these other things. We didn't know it would get
Yeah.
worse. But we saw kind of where we were heading. And so for us, I think it's important now as DEI is under attack to tell the story of the practitioners and those who are working in this spaces and not only the challenges and successes that they face, but also their engagement with students. And so
Mm.
I think about those
Yes.
personal stories of the students that are in those centers and that you got to work with and that you see grow from the moment they get on campus to the time they graduate, and even thinking about the relationships that we still have with many of those students, and how that's just grown throughout the years, and just the importance that these spaces have been kind of safe spaces and refugees. I know what the word I'm trying to say, but
Ref-
Refuge. Yeah, yeah.
refuges.
this is what refuge for students of marginalized identities. And so I think it was important um, to kind of share that story, but I think also reflecting on our experience and knowing kind of the situation we were in a protest that was national news and where every news
Yeah.
channel was on our campus, we were like, there has to be many other stories that have gone untold that we want to provide space for them to share their experiences, but also amplify their voices and
Hmm.
see themselves also as scholars within our field as well.
Hmm. For sure. I think also there's a dearth of
Mm-hmm.
scholarship of practitioners speaking to their own experiences and kind of sharing their testimonies. There is, as Heather,
Mm-hmm.
um, research and scholarship about identity centers, but it is often from the perspective of what do these spaces do? What do they produce? How do they support student experiences? And, there is some work out there around closures of centers, Patton's work, Laurie Patton Davis's work around cultural centers specifically, I think is, to my knowledge, the only book that really focuses on centers. And it's focused on cultural centers and in a similar vein, right? Providing important insights around strategies and practices and how these spaces came to be. But I think we were looking for that space years ago to kind of tell stories that were often relegated to the margins. And so for us, this almost 10 years later, at the point where we developed the idea, it was about how do we now use the space that we have to then provide that space for others.
Wow. I have thought a lot about where that community happens. And I absolutely agree with you that it's not easy to find, right? And I think even within our professional associations, you're either, focusing on our identities, salient identities, or the work that we do. But what happens when those things directly overlap and intersect? And I think that's um, a really important function that this book will serve is to kind of talk about that lived experience.
Mhm.
Um, Stephanie, can you talk a little bit more about, what are some of the themes? I mean, I talked in the intro about survival and healing. Um, and how did that kind of resonate with you as an editor, also as a contributor, as your own, having had your own lived experience? How did that kind of hit you as the one of the two editors?
Ah, that's such a powerful question. I
Mm,
think a little bit like a brick. It'd
yeah.
be a little bit like a it just felt so familiar, when I've been removed, in a sense, from actually being the director of an identity center for a minute now. And I found myself, I felt like in so many of their stories, in the emotions that were evoked, in the ways that they found connection, even in their vulnerability and like wanting a space to share that vulnerability. I feel like in each chapter, you see the authors demonstrate this commitment to truth telling, to like giving
Mm,
their account of their experience in a way that was raw and vulnerable and courageous, right? I mean, it's a challenge by choice, so you really choose what you want to share, but I feel like for all of the authors, they took it there. And I think took it there in such creative ways that I feel like evoke this kind of critical cultural knowledge that is often relegated to the margins of academia, but also just like intellectual production at large. And so, we saw authors using approaches like Asian critical race theory and plantation politics and feminismo or conocimiento, radical love, radical healing, and a lot of other approaches. I think one of the chapters that really hit me. They were all powerful in their own way, but there was one where someone wrote it in a way where they were writing a letter to their past self.
oh,
And that, I mean, there were a couple that obviously, like, I was emotional, like, reading them. I'm like trying to edit them, but like, emotional reading them. And to think about, wow, like what would I tell myself at that time? And I think that's work that I try to do now with my students around like preparing them as early career professionals or even individuals who have been in the field. But just the level of commitment to their own healing and to doing so like thoughtfully and intentionally and in a way that would like create community for others. I think that was another huge piece was just the community that they would find in order to survive or to kind of seek healing in their work, and the ways they relied on other people for care, for caring for themselves. But even how it seemed to find community through creating the work, right? Through creating their chapters was another piece. And I think a final theme would be a commitment to like to their pursuit of well-being and self-actualization. Like we saw that repeatedly. The authors were really trying to figure out how do I care for myself, or how do I rectify the ways that I didn't care for myself, and making sense of that. And so they're really raw testimonies and just really vulnerable pieces. And I think every single one of them holds like a really special place in my heart and in my being.
mm,
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I would say ditto to everything that Stephanie said. But I think for me, it took me back to 10 years ago as we were editing it
yeah.
and thinking about our experience. And so I remember, I've talked a lot about critical hope, and I always credit Heather Shea during her presidential address at ACPA for just giving me the language for something I didn't know that I was already using. And so from there, I've gotten the book. I go read it. Great, life-changing. Um,
The book
but it
is
made me think
amazing.
about a moment during that period, Stephanie. I don't know if you remember this part. That we were in the midst of the protest, and mind you, like I'd never experienced anything like this, and so I'm trying to lead, but also I'm like, this is also a new experience. But I remember within the Black Culture Center, we had a kitchen, and I remember like going into the kitchen and like falling on my knees and almost crying. And I said a prayer, and I'm like, I really need you to help me get through this. Like these
Mm,
kids need me. and I
Hmm.
don't know what I'm doing. Like I am trying my best. I think what was also interesting was I was a doc student at the same point in time. And so
Mm.
November 9th, 2015, I was set to defend my dissertation. And so
Wow. Wow. I did not know that part of the story, Jonathan.
Mhm. And did.
I had scheduled this before the protest to make sure my committee, like I had turned in my dissertation. So I'm like, this is 4.5 years of work. And so that morning on November 9th, was when the system president, the chancellor stepped down. I stayed at home that morning, but Stephanie was on campus because I had to defend at 1 o'clock. And so my supervisor was like, just stay at home, focus, lock in. And I'm like, okay, I'm going into
Get it.
uncharted territories. But I remember prior to that, some of the students and some of the orgs and groups that I advised had asked about coming to my defense. And I was like, absolutely not. It's a vulnerable space. And so they asked me again, and they were like, we want to come. And I was like, well, why do y'all want to come so bad? And they were like, well, we've never seen someone get their doctorate. Like we've seen you
Mm.
writing, we've seen you studying all these things. And they had already voted on this name that they were going to call me Dr. J. And so they were like, we already came up with this name for you. So this is like pre my defense. And so we get to the defense. Stephanie shows up, everybody shows up, but about 70 students showed up. And I told my chair before, I was like, the students say they're coming, but I was like, we're also in the midst of this national protest, so they may not show up. But they were there, they were engaged. They actually waited in the hallway, when the committee kicks everybody out and they
Yeah.
just me and actually stayed there. I expected for them to be gone. I knew Stephanie and others would be there waiting, but they were out there on their laptops. And so for me, that's always a pivotal moment when I think about one critical hope, but also the role of mentorship of like, it's
Yeah.
not always about me. Like, even though I may have been scared to have them in the room, I was in this moment
Hmm.
of a protest and something going on that I had never experienced before. But the symbolism of what I represented to them was super important. And so that's a lesson that I've always carried with me because I'm glad that I didn't say no and didn't tell them that they couldn't come because having them be there, having them there to support me, and even just reflecting and looking back at pictures and everything, it's a memory that I probably will carry with me the rest of my life.
Hmm.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yes, it's
That
it's that it's actually, and I just want to add that when the chair of Jonathan's committee like announced that he had passed, the roar in that room like is something that I can still hear.
mm,
And it is like emotional. I think like both of
hmm
us and even like preparing for this. I mean, Jonathan said to me like, "Are you gonna
hmm
cry?" Like, because
Yeah, I didn't
it's
expect to cry.
yeah, it
Yeah.
really is.
Mm,
It's about to be 10 years later. And that
hmm
same day that he defended was the same day that the president of the system resigned. Like the level of just
Yeah.
I mean, talk about like being, like, how people talk about like diamonds and how they're like crafted under pressure.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the level of pressure at that time, and to kind of go in and like be very composed, despite the fact of like how much I know that he was experiencing internally, and just being able to be that model of possibility for those students. I mean, it wasn't my defense, but it was a moment that I will never
Mm.
forget because it was like they were watching like a football game or something. My goodness.
I love it. It's not a football game, it's a doctoral defense. There's
Yes.
definitely rules, but
Oh no, I'm saying like when it was like if they were watching somebody score a touchdown once
yeah.
that applause
Oh,
rang, I'm like,
that's
oh my goodness, like
so
this is
great.
amazing.
That is so great. I love that so much. Um, wow, that is really powerful kind of juxtaposition of those two things, kind of happening simultaneously, but also how important identity center practitioners are to that student experience and the student communities. Um, and yet I think often the identity center practitioner, just as the title of your book kind of indicates, are the ones who are getting a lot of institutional pushback for the type of work that they're doing. So, Jonathan, I know that in this particular moment, this is difficult. I'm sure it was difficult then as well. But how do folks who work in these centers navigate that institutional pushback, but also take care of themselves, right? I mean, I think there is the rest is resistance, Hershey's work, and like it also feels, I know from my own experience, like you can't do it quite enough. Like you're always gonna kind of be feeling like, oh, there's so much more I could do. Um, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I would say definitely we're in a much different time than we were many years ago. But I felt like when I was in that space, I remember, and even now, I feel like always leading like with facts and figures. Like I feel like you can't
Yeah.
argue me with data. And so if I'm presenting a program, this is the literature, these are the data from our institution nationally, there's not much we can argue about. And so I think that's always kind of been my approach through the various types of identity centers that I've worked in. I would say when thinking about how do we navigate pushback and well-being, I think definitely taking care of yourself. So even, that story that I shared about the dissertation defense and this experience, like we lived through it and we survived, but I think the healing was also equally just important afterwards. And so I had to get a therapist because I was like, I have all of these emotions, these feelings. I've experienced all these things. Like, even after the defense, the next day was when Yik Yak was still a thing, and people were like, we're gonna shoot campus up, and like we're gonna do all of these things, and we're like, dang, like people are anonymous. People were calling from like other states. Like I remember I got a call from like Texas, and this man is like ranting on the phone, like had no connection to the institution, but just was like spewing hate. And it's like one of those things that like, post some of the challenges that we've seen at other institutions, that you have to take them seriously. So we were like bunkered down in the Black Culture Center. Well, I didn't think I was
Mm,
going to tell the story, but I'm going to tell it. But I got a text that night. Oh, I'm not going to cry.
it's okay.
And the students, like, my initial reaction, I remember texting Stephanie and telling, like, and the folks that worked in the center with me, I'm like, we're going to close the center. Like, we're going to close the center the next day because, like, people are threatening and all of that. And I want to keep everybody safe. But the students texted that night. They were like, nope, we want to occupy the BCC. Like, that's our home and we're not letting anybody um, run us out. And so, ooh. And I remember that morning I got up, and it was on the news about the protests. And I remember going to Walmart on my way to work to get a bat just in case. I don't know what I was going to do with this bat, but just in case something went down. But I remember getting there, and the students were already there. Some of the students from MPHC had already. They were like, "We walked around the building, we surveillanced it, like everything is good, we can go in." And we were locked in to that building. Like, I mean, people brought food, we had pizza, we had all these things, and it was a space of joy and celebration, but also like, this is our home, this is our space. You're not about to scare us from it. And so I think about that in the healing aspect and well-being, and why I think going to therapy and making sure that I was better after that was important. Because again, we're balancing these roles of like, yes, I'm here to advocate and be here for the students, but I also, this is my job too. I got bills to pay. I got things I got to do. And so
Right.
I think that always resonates with me. I think you already touched on it earlier, that the concept of rest is resistance. I think
Yeah.
you have to rest. Like if we are not well and we are not whole, then we can't show up and do the work that we need to do, to move our institutions, our centers, and be here for our students and move it forward. And so I think, as cliche as it sounds, you have to rest because our bodies will let us know when we are
Hmm.
tired and burnt out. And I think we have to listen to that. I think we've seen over the last couple of years the number of Black women that have
Yeah.
passed away, some even on stage from the labor that they were putting out. And I think there was a article was like, and the show went on, and the woman, was taken off stage, and they continued with the program. And I'm like, we need to be here to fight this fight. We
Yeah.
need to be here to support our students. We need to be here to be able to tell this story, to be able to tell the next generation, for folks to be able to read about it, to hear about it, to listen to this podcast. And so, Stephanie, I know you have something to say, so I'm going to dry my eyes while you take it from here.
I appreciate you. I think I think that many navigate their well-being and institutional pushback, external pushback with grace as best they can. But I think that the reality is that some might not be at all. I mean, I think
Yeah.
about myself at a time that was, challenging, of course, in its own right. I don't know what it would look like for me today, but I
Mhm.
think at that time as an early career practitioner, like my well-being was the last thing that I was thinking about. Um, at all times. I went to work at 9 in the morning and sometimes didn't get home until 9. And I only lived 7 minutes from campus. So there no commute really involved. And I think about myself at that time and just like I was so passionate about what I was doing and I cared so much about it. And I tell this to my students. The idea of like worker being my identity is
Yeah.
so ingrained in me. I think like as a woman of color, as observing my own mother just kind of be just the ultimate hustler. Um, and I think of working so hard in education to like make something of myself that my career really was like my focus and I didn't create boundaries around that thing that I was so passionate about. And so um, I think institutional leaders and also supervisors to think about how they aren't placing the burden on identity center practitioners to be the ones who have to navigate pushback, who have to navigate figuring out their own well-being. How, when they come into your office to talk about their day or whatever's on the agenda, how are you integrating well-being into the conversation and ensuring that people are creating boundaries around their work? Because these institutions will work you until you have nothing left to give. And I think even the students, I mean, we love them, but sometimes even creating boundaries with them and helping them understand
Mhm.
that when I'm not here, it's not because I don't care. It's because I
Right.
also, have to have something outside of my work. So I think people navigate it with grace, and I also think people are figuring out how to navigate it, and that's where supervisors and institutional leaders need to step in to kind of give that guidance and ensure that this is a sustainable career path for the long term.
Mhm. That really resonates for me for on a number of different levels. One, because I think I feel like I have this conversation regularly with the people in my orbit, but also that like self-imposing boundaries is a privilege, right? And to not be judged for saying, no, I am going home. And who gets to do that, right? Who gets to say that? And I think identity center practitioner, maybe it's partially because our identities are so intrinsically interwoven with the work. It becomes like there's not really a, you know, balance. Like everything is like
Yeah.
the same
And the
thing.
assumptions I think too that people make about that. Oh,
Yeah.
like, well, shouldn't you care more than
Yeah.
like leaving at 5 o'clock? And
Yeah.
then adding on to that expectations and stereotypes because of your identity that, that kind of all funnels in and it
Yeah.
creates an opportunity, right,
Mhm.
for, beautiful, challenging work, but it also creates a lot of opportunity for exhaustion and burnout.
Yeah. So, Jonathan, you are now in a senior role. I don't know if Identity Center folks report to you or not, but
I do.
um, I do think that it's important, as Stephanie was saying, that, supervisors, senior leaders, recognize the toll that these positions might take on staff. So, what is your suggestion or, um, what is your approach to making sure that you move beyond kind of this like performative allyship to really meaningfully support staff who work in these spaces?
Yeah. Um, I would say now, I think one is listening with intention and listening to their stories, and the things that they experience, either that they're navigating on campus when they come to share stories that students may share with them. I think that's just very important. I think sometimes you can easily dismiss it and be like, oh no, this is, this person didn't mean that or this didn't happen. But I think actually being there when something does happen and advocating for them, I think a biggest thing is institutional funding. Like if we are going to talk about that these are our values, these are the things that are important to us, then for these centers and for these staff to be successful, they need the resources, they need the staffing, they need the support. And some of it is like not laboring those specific centers to do all of the identity-based work and knowing that it should be
Yeah.
infused in everybody's role. Or when they have programs, like how are we all showing up, not just the folks of one marginalized identity, but showing up to support this student group or support this center. I think the other thing, and I think I've learned this throughout my career because I didn't do it well at the beginning is what you talked about as far as like setting these boundaries and knowing that everything is not an emergency. And I feel like a lot of times we operate in a way that like, oh, I see this email, I need to respond, or the student, and like I need to do all of these things immediately, and knowing that we have to take care of ourselves. So that is something that I try to push for folks. I'm like, no, please take a day off if you're not feeling well and there's something, if we need to move chairs, we'll move the chairs. If we need to move tables, like don't I don't want you coming to work and you're not feeling well just because you feel like you need to be here or that if you aren't here then the show won't go on. And so I think and again, I'm still working on modeling that behavior because I have all these roles that I hold and things that I do and I'm like, no, I'm good, I'm fine and all of those things. I think also the only other thing I would say is thinking about senior leaders is moving beyond the performative allyship. And so I know we were at a point in time where everybody's making a statement and everybody's,
Yeah.
oh, we want to do all of it. Like, we don't need to do that. Like, unless, again, you have some resources, staffing, some sort of support behind your statement.
Yeah.
I think that's just is very important. I think also too, like I would say for senior leaders, it's just showing up. It doesn't always need to be a crisis when your face is seen. Like just showing up to say, like, how are the students? How are you all? Like,
Mhm.
what's going on? Stop in, get some lunch, that kind of thing. I think moving beyond that space, especially in this day and age of kind of social media where like everything's just so immediate and we're always running and doing all these things, but like taking the time to slow down and just be like, what is your origin story? Like, where are you from? What is your major? And all these things I think are super important. And I think it sets the space, the institution up in a way that like when a crisis does happen, if the relationships are already built, then
Yeah.
we're able to navigate the crisis in a very different manner versus
Right.
it being the first time that we see whoever it is
Mhm.
that yes,
Yeah.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I think I was thinking a lot of the same things that Jonathan was saying, especially as somebody who observed it and
Yeah.
experienced it, you know, back in the days. But I think building a little bit on what you're sharing, Jonathan, it's, for a lot of our students who are of marginalized identities and marginalized communities, relational dynamics are really important
Yeah.
to them to feel like someone cares about me, someone is invested in me. I think it's one thing like to show up in a space and do
Mhm.
office hours in it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's another thing to show up in a space and interact with the
Yep.
students and get to know them and ask about them. It's one thing to give funding, like, oh, here's your funding to do these events. It's another thing to show up at students' events and not just the big ones, not the
Yeah.
ones that are like the signature events that, oh, we expect to see these faces. No, the ones that they coordinate for themselves, right? If it's appropriate. But to know that you have to actually engage with them. And I think sometimes senior, or institutional leaders, especially particularly of privileged identities, sometimes there's almost like a fear of
Hmm.
interacting with students and like you can't be afraid. You have to kind of get in there with them. I think the other thing is that the ways, there's that work around um Amado Padilla has cultural taxation, Hirschfield and Joseph built on it with identity taxation. I think in a lot of ways, we're talking about individuals with that kind of work, but our centers experience an identity taxation. I remember back in the day when it was like, oh, Black students, we understand that you're struggling on campus. Go to the Black Culture Center. Well, the Black Culture Center has two full-time staff in it.
Yeah.
How are they serving? Like, John, do you
Yeah.
remember that?
Two full-time staff and $5, right? Like
Right.
and we do a lot with that $5, but
Money
Right.
stretch.
yes.
Um, the only other thing I would add that I was thinking about when I was thinking about the book is each of the authors shared their story, but they
Mhm.
also were intentional about offering these same sort of suggestions and feedback to future
Yes.
supervisors of
Good.
identity center practitioners or future leaders. And so I appreciated that they didn't just tell their story, they gave folks next steps. We also, for the forward, we had Dr. Jordan Shelby West, who we all know on the screen, do our forward. And I know when Stephanie and I were just thinking about the book, we were like, who should do the forward? We were like, do we need a forward? Do we not need a forward? We were like, no, this would be good. And Jordan, just immediately came to mind just with her
Mhm.
words, her way, just the way that she writes, talks, does all the things was like super important. And she's always been a good friend of mine. And then her and Stephanie met and they formed their own relationship and friendship. And so I'm excited for people just to even start
Oh,
the off with that forward and then to get into each of the chapters of the authors as well.
Especially her being right in that space of also
yeah.
being, an institutional leader now and just writing such an exquisite forward that I feel like captures the space between where it's like the space of being an identity center and understanding that work, but also being an institutional leader and understanding and like melding those together is like beautifully captured in that forward. And we appreciate her.
Love that. I have a question not related to what we prepped, but it's related to this idea of what role senior leaders can play. And I'm really curious because you two, both on the same campus, came together. One of the gaps I think I've seen is when identity centers are almost pitted against each other and there's not solidarity across those units. It's like we're all trying to get the $5, and so it creates some really interesting dynamics. Do you have suggestions of what senior leaders can do to help identity centers build like coalition work and collaborative opportunities? Is that even worth kind of exploring?
Do you want to go first or you want me to?
Oh, go ahead.
I think there's some work around this, and I can't remember
Yeah.
who wrote the piece, but I think one of them is thinking intentionally about resourcing
Yeah.
in a way that doesn't position these spaces in conflict or in tension with one another.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so, what does it mean to resource these spaces in a way that even is like collaborative and maybe where you're
Mhm.
bringing people to the table to do so in a way that is thoughtful and, reasoned and makes sense and
Mhm.
isn't just, okay, maybe, I don't know, I'm thinking we don't want to see this group upset, so let's give them money
Yeah.
and because I feel like that's what ends up happening. Um, I think I want to speak, if I can, to with the practitioners themselves, as
Yeah.
I think that speaking to institutional leaders is important. But
Yeah.
for me, coming into a space where Jonathan was already working, for example, at the University of Missouri, it was super important to me to do what you just said, is to think about how we engage in solidarity across these spaces, because I never wanted to feel like being, the director of the Multicultural Center meant that women students should not come into the
Mhm.
space
Mhm.
or Black students should not come into this space, or queer students or trans
Yeah.
students should not come into this space. That was always really important to me. And in order for me to engage in that, I needed to show up, which is like another thing on the plate,
Yes.
right? But I
Sure.
needed to show up for my colleagues in those spaces and not through my words, not through an email or through oh,
Mhm.
let's do this collaboration. It was through attending events and forging those relationships in an intentional way. It was in advocating in meetings for things that might not affect, quote unquote, my students,
Yeah.
right? And engaging in those actions. And I feel like when we do that amongst each other, we are more powerful when we have to go to institutional leaders that we don't just advocate for our own, we advocate for others. And I feel like I love that you asked this question because to me, that's always been so important in this work that they don't pit us against each other, that we work, collaboratively. I don't know if Jonathan, if you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I would say I too am appreciative of this question. I think yes, Stephanie has always just who she is in her being, been very intentional about relationship building. And like it could have went very different ways because there
Hmm.
were some disparities in how both of our spaces were resources. Like the Black Culture Center was its own standalone building, like kitchen, like all of these things. And so that easily could have been a situation where we were pitted against each other, but I think that we knew early on that we were better together.
Hmm.
And so it was important, Stephanie moved from New Jersey. I had moved from Virginia. So we were both in Missouri. We had never lived here before. Like this was a foreign place to us. We're trying to figure it out. I had been there maybe 2 or 3 years before she got there, starting off initially as a full-time doc student, then eventually becoming part-time and then working full-time. But I think just that sentiment of that relationship building, kind of what we mentioned earlier, was super important. I think also just like Stephanie and I've created a friendship, and like the fact that we're back at the same institution is just kind of mind blowing.
So great.
We've been there to support each other. We've cried, we laughed, we've done all these things. Like I love her mom when she comes to visit. My mom and my grandmother are like, "Oh, can I call you daughter? Can I do all?" And so they love. But I think also for me, it was also me learning. And so Stephanie being from Jersey, being Puerto Rican, like. I don't speak Spanish, but let me tell you, I'm trying all the foods. I'm listening to the stories. Stephanie's got me hooked on Bad Bunny. I don't even know what Bad Bunny is saying, but when I tell you that I like want to go to his concert because I watched his show on Amazon Live, I was like drawn completely in. And I think that cultural exchange and being able to learn and grow with each other is just so important. And I think it goes back to just like communication, like just being open with each other, being able to listen. And Stephanie and I, like, we will bicker like siblings as well.
Yeah.
We're together a lot. And so yeah, I'll be like, Stephanie will call and be like, Stephanie, I'm getting off the phone. Bye. And then like she'll call back and be like, oh yeah, I forgot to say this. But I think we also found the things that we love. Like we love watching Housewives together. We love sending memes and GIFs to each other. Like it just is so, I don't know. It's just a loving relationship that I'm always
Yeah.
appreciative of and just so thankful that the universe not only aligned us over a decade ago, and even though we kept in touch all of this time, but then
Mhm.
saw fit to bring us back together now, 10 years later, to be able to be in these roles and to produce scholarship and to kind of help usher in the next generation.
Hmm.
I love that. So this is the actually the second episode I've recorded this week where the two people knew each other for a series of time, right? Like, and I think that shows in not only the way that you all are talking, but finishing each other's sentences, and also just like the way that you've collaborated over the years. And I'm so grateful to be able to be a part of the witnessing this conversation between the two of you. And I have no doubt this episode is just going to really speak to people who recognize the power of those relationships across decades, across campuses. Um, that's really phenomenal. As you all have been telling stories and sharing your experiences, like I've really been struck. I mean, I know the book is really about stories. Can you, Stephanie, maybe talk a little bit about the role? Why is storytelling important? And, why is it particularly important when people feel isolated in the labor of care, resistance work? What do stories do for us?
Absolutely. I also love this question. I think my perspectives on this really come from the activist, intellectual
Yeah.
contributions of women of color, thinkers, scholars, educators. And I'm always going to speak that. I'm sure if people have heard me speak before, they've heard me say that, and I don't care. I'm going to say it every time. I think one group in particular I'm thinking about is those who created the Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, which is no longer in existence. I think that was in 1980. And, you have women of color like Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith and Shetty Moraga who came together to create that press because they recognized that there was a dearth in publishing presses that would publish the work of women of color.
Yeah.
And they understood that it was important to engage in sharing about their own experience, their knowledge, and what they had to offer to reveal how oppression functions in distinct
Yeah.
ways in their lives, to reveal those realities, because those realities were in many ways being suppressed, or as Dotson, explains, like quieted, or smothered. And so I think part of storytelling is engaging in an act of community, is that through telling that story, even if it's written, right? If we're not engaging in this space, like how the three of us are, and as we're
Yeah.
sharing, we're feeling connected, even if we're in a virtual space, right? I
Mhm.
feel connected to both of you in this space.
Mhm.
But that same thing can happen in writing. I'll never forget the first time I read Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, like feeling completely enveloped by
Mhm.
that work and by that contribution, feeling seen and held in that body of work. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, is because we recognize what it feels like to feel isolated when you don't have strong. Luckily, Jonathan and I had each other. We also had our wonderful colleague at the time, and who we both still keep in touch with, Felma Buckner, who is like a light in this world. And, we had each other, but even that still felt like our little community.
Mhm.
And to be able to have work out there that other people can connect to, that can, maybe not eliminate that isolation, but buffer it, for us is really powerful. And I think we need this now, especially because I think there is a challenge, right, to feeling that like hope and that sense of connection in this work.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
The only thing I would add is the, and I'm gonna be very brief and quick with this story, but this the importance of storytelling to make sure that the accurate story is being told. And so
That part.
what's interesting, so at Elon, I teach in the Masters of Higher Ed program, History of Higher Education. So we actually have a student in Stephanie Nass class who just graduated from Mizzou this past year. And so one of the assignments that I have them do is their alma mater presentation. And so, of course, she did hers on Mizzou, and she incorporated like stuff about the protests in there. But when I was like looking at it, I was like, oh wait, girl, huh? And I'm like, and so it was a great learning opportunity because we
Mhm.
were able to then talk about like, okay, this is what was passed down to you 6 years later when
Mhm.
you enrolled after this had all ended. But let me tell you from the person who was there and lived it. And like, she showed a video and thing, and I was like, oh, well, let me tell you that student story, that student, like I can point them out. And I remember calling Stephanie after class and being like, such an interesting like class that we had today. And they actually do read our article that we mentioned earlier later in the semester. So I think it's in the next 2 weeks they'll read it. But it was just interesting just to hear being removed and 10 years away from it, the
Yeah.
narrative that was being told and how it was being shared. And I was like, okay, Liza, we got to make sure, the older folks, the elders, whoever, are continuing the story so that it's accurate and that, as people leave, sometimes history gets lost and like people go on to different spaces, but making sure that this generation, the youth of today, actually are fully aware of what exactly happened in that space.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the reasons that we wrote that first work, because we
Mhm.
wanted to share our experience, that it was really kind of nowhere, right? It was invisible in the conversation. And also the experiences of women of color activists at that time, who had become largely invisible in mainstream media. It had become about, one man and a football team, instead of what this has been a buildup, right? And like women of color, Black women in particular, were engaged in this work, and somehow their names and their stories are completely invisible in this conversation, which is something that we brought attention to in that first article.
Yes, the storytelling and documentation, it does help establish the record, right? But like I'm always cautious and conscious of the ways that it can be revised without the
Hmm.
people who were there. And
Mhm.
then all of a sudden the narrative is like a completely different thing. And you're like, wait a second. And so I know one of the first things I did when I was brought in as the director of a women's center on a different campus, not here, was talk with people who were here when the center was established, right? So like the telling of the stories of the like, those who fought for that space, I think that's another kind of place that can be sometimes just it gets moved into like institutional lore and then
Mm.
maybe not even recorded. So
Right.
um, I'm glad you told that story because I do think sometimes students also will have their own perspective of things and then that becomes reality.
Sure.
Um, so wow. So Jonathan, you and Stephanie have a second volume coming out, which I am so grateful and honored to have had the opportunity to contribute a chapter about my experience directing two different campus-based women and gender equity centers, which neither of which currently exist. Um, which during the process of writing the chapter, I had to keep kind of going back and like, is this still relevant? Like, what is my experience? I'd left. And anyway, I can't wait for that new volume to come out next year. Can you talk a bit about how you intend to expand and continue the conversation that you started with shaking the table and still shaking the table,
Shaking it. So
but
yes, the
still.
next volume will focus on just supporting students, unity and activism.
Mhm.
For us, when we put the call out originally, we didn't intend for it to be a two-parter. But we got so many submissions, and I remember when we were looking at all the submissions, we were like, these people have stories to tell. Like we can't say no. And so I remember us going back to the publisher and being like, hey, we got a lot of submissions. Can we negotiate doing two separate books? Because like the story needs to be told. And so I think just as much as we're excited about this first one to, next year when Still Shaking the Table comes out, I think to hear those stories is such a compliment to this first book and is such a good bookend to look at the five themes across all both books. And so I think we're super excited about that,
Stephanie,
Stephanie.
anything you want to add?
Yeah. I think the only thing I'll add to this is that in this current volume, right, that's supposed to be released by the time this is airing, Jonathan and I kind of focus more on positioning the necessity of the text and the need to
Mm,
engage and center the voices and the work of practitioners, whereas um, within the next volume, I think we share more about our connection and frame that connection through this idea of scholar siblings, which is something that we've been trying to conceptualize for a while now. And I think within the first chapter of that text, we're finally able to give that relationship of scholar sibling, that conceptualization wings and highlight how we have this shared history and this connection that has been nurtured over time. And that in that connection, we've experienced challenge and joy alongside one another. And that this relationship that we have has really been instrumental in cultivating us as scholars. And that part of the reason that we are able to be successful in this work is because we have experienced and supported one another through those experiences. And so I'm thinking like about my sister, like my sister has challenged me, she has pushed me, she's emboldened me to be the best version of myself. Sometimes she's brought out hard versions of myself, but I also feel like Jonathan has done this for me as well. And knowing me in that unique way, and one another in those unique ways really transcends the relationship of colleague. It informs how we continue to develop and execute projects that others can find connection and hope in. And so thinking a little bit about how are we cultivating these scholar sibling relationships, because it's important for us who have been engaged in this work to continue engaging in this work and to continue to find relationship with one another. And so we're excited to kind of like share that finally, like within that next volume.
All right, we need to do a whole nother episode on scholar siblings. I love this concept. I think it is really powerful because you're more than collaborators, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's really clear in this conversation, but the idea that you're a chosen family and you're connected through this like shared process of creating these texts. Yeah, I think there are lots of examples of people out there who you always see their names together, right? That I bet would love to have a conversation about that. So
Awesome.
we'll put that out into the universe, and anybody who's listening who's like, we're scholar siblings, we want to join. Um, so in kind of closure, I think today, and I could just keep talking with you all for at least another hour or so, but um, I do think that these pieces, these two books are really love letters to identity center practitioners. They are affirming and celebratory. But what would you like to say as far as one piece of wisdom or advice or affirmation to folks who are doing this work who might be in that space of, why am I doing this? Right? This is hard. My institution's defunded our program, or now I'm trying to do this, but in more of an underground kind of way. I'd love to hear you each talk about that. And then if you have linked a LinkedIn or email or whatever way you would like folks to get in touch with you, I'd love to hear that as well. I'll start with you, Stephanie.
Thank you for saying these books are love letters because they really, I think, are. And like this question, it makes me emotional. I think about like what I would tell myself 10 years ago ish. And I think the first thing is what you are able to give does not define you. I think in this work, we want to give so much of ourselves as a demonstration that we care, and not just that we care, but that students matter, and they do. They do matter so much, especially marginalized students, especially students of color, queer students of color, women of color. Like, you all matter. Um, and I think we want to share that, but what you give doesn't define who you are. You're more than just what you can extend, and it's okay to not be able to give all of yourself at all times. That's unfair. Um, and I think the second thing is that you deserve the same love and care you are offering others,
Mm,
and the same intentionality that you're arriving to your work with. You deserve to arrive to your well-being and your personhood and your humanity with. I think that's something that we all can say to ourselves more, especially identity center practitioners, especially those of marginalized identities. And so that is the affirmation that I hope that not just, this volume um, carries, but that you can kind of affirm yourself with every single day.
I love that. I love that. Thank you.
So I would
Jonathan.
say there's three things. One, that your work matters, even if you don't see the results in real time. I
Mhm.
always think about just the students' lives who may not get it in the moment, but like a few years later, you get that text or that email that's like, I remember when you said this to, and like keep that at the forefront. Like think about the people. I think we've talked about the importance of storytelling and lineage. One of the chapters in the book that I love is three center directors from the same institution in three generations. And they all told their story together about navigating that space, the institution. It phenomenal. And you can see how they all learn from each other and even to come together and now write this text, it's so powerful. So that's that importance of just storytelling and staying connected to those that came before you. And I would say the last thing, when you think about shaking the table, is
Mm,
just the spirit of Sankofa. And so reaching back it doesn't just need to be your seat at the table. If you need to bump somebody over, we can squeeze another seat in. But it just doesn't need to be that concept of like you have to be the only one. Like there's room for more folks, and that's just something that's really important to me is making sure that like you are thinking about others, that you're not just thinking about yourself, because it's not just about you. It's about this the center, the students, but it's also about the people you supervise that you work with, and again, thinking about the next generation. And so those are the three things I would say. I would say while you're at the table, one of the table legs may break. You may need to prop it up with a book. Um, but hold your seat there and enjoy it and sit there and just kind of be in that moment, in that space, and thinking about all the people that came before you that allowed you to be able to pull that seat up at the table. So
Hmm.
out in there, I will say if you want to get in contact with me, LinkedIn, so Jonathan A. McElderry, find me on there. You'll find my email, everything there. But find me on LinkedIn, Google me. We'll be able to connect. But I'm happy and open to connect with folks who are interested.
You can find me on LinkedIn as well, Stephanie Hernandez Rivera or Stephanie Hernandez Rivera, depends on your accent. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Instagram too, Stefala Jefa underscore, which translates to Stephanie the boss, basically. And Heather, thank you so much for inviting us. And in terms of using a book to prop up that table, just don't use ours.
Yes. Yeah. That book
They
needs to
can
be
get
on the
it.
table, open,
Or you can get
read.
copies and put one on the table and then you use the foundation to prop it up.
Oh
But
my
thank you,
gosh.
Heather. I'm so appreciative of just, again, Student Affairs Now, of you, of all those behind the scenes that made this possible. So thank you so much.
Well, the equally grateful for both of you sharing time and space with me today. I always end the episodes feeling like this is exactly what I needed today. And I think this last hour, however long we've been talking, uh, has really just filled me and made me think a lot about my own experiences. So thank you for that gift today. Um, I also need to thank our sponsor, as always, the Evolve Institute of Higher Education Leadership. Um, Evolve is evolving. Doctors Brian Rao, Don Lee, and our own Keith Edwards are excited to announce the Evolve Institute for Higher Education Leadership. Evolve offers leadership coaching journeys for executives, and emerging leaders, as well as specific leading for equity focused cohort. If you are ready to evolve your leadership team or invest in your personal leadership, they would love to connect with you to talk about their in-person, hybrid, and online modalities to evolve your leadership for us all. As we mark 5 years of Student Affairs Now, we are especially grateful for all of the ways that this community of listeners, guests, and collaborators has grown. We've hosted hundreds of conversations like this one, grounded in care, reflection, and in shared commitment to learning and leading with purpose. So to our audience, thank you for being a part of this learning community. And whether you've been with us since the beginning or tuning in for the first time, we hope this episode leaves you feeling renewed and connected to the larger community of educators who make this work possible. Once again, I'm Heather Shea. Thank you for listening. Thank you to everybody who's been a part of this community. And here's to the next 5 years and beyond.